US President Donald Trump is trying his best to weaponize the tariffs against India, but the messaging coming in from within the United States, from the White House, is appearing more and more contradictory and convoluted, devoid of logic as time passes by. So much so that politicians from within the Republican and the Democratic Party also are condemning Trump's tariff imposition on India. And while the move continues to draw condemnation from outside the United States as well, because to put it simply, free trade cannot just be on Trump's terms. It has to be on equal footing. Let's first tell you what US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had to say. Listen to this.
President Trump is trying to end this war in Ukraine that never would have started if he'd been president. And, our European allies need to step up. I don't see them threatening the tariffs on the Indians. And as a matter of fact, they're the ones buying the refined products that's made from the Russian oil.
Now, let's just focus on the last two lines there. Scott Bessent is clearly admitting that Europe is buying refined Russian oil products. But why is the United States then not imposing tariffs on Europe and naming them as a punishment for buying Russian oil? And if punishment for purchasing Russian oil is actually the problem, then the US buyers and intentions are clearly suspicious at this point, a huge question mark, given that it is public knowledge that China is the biggest buyer and Turkey another major buyer of Russian oil. In fact, the US Treasury Secretary is, in a way, seemingly instigating Europe against India. Is it because the United States is scared about Russia, China and India coming together as a formidable force? Some believe even trying to create a wedge between the three by adopting different yardsticks on the same tariff aspects. Because the statistics alone speak for themselves. New Delhi, Moscow, Beijing represent nearly 37% of the world's population, while BRICS alone represents more than 41% of the world's GDP as of last year. More than 41% of the world's GDP. And with Prime Minister Modi meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian President Vladimir Putin during the upcoming SCO summit starting this weekend, the US appears to be clearly worried. In fact, the advisor to Donald Trump has blamed Prime Minister Modi and India for the Russia-Ukraine war, stating that Ukraine is, quote-unquote, Modi's war. In fact, it's baffling that for his boss, Donald Trump, it has been Biden's war ever since. Prime Minister Modi, remember, has maintained that this is not an era of war. The frustration is so evident with Navarro that he further called Indians arrogant. But here's a reality check on the trade between Russia and the United States. The trade between the two sides has grown by 20% since the Trump administration returned to power. 20%. A fact revealed by Russian President Vladimir Putin during his meeting with Donald Trump at the recent Alaska summit. And if Ukraine is Prime Minister Modi's war, as Navarro claims, then he seems to be clearly unaware of the global dynamics at play. After the Alaska summit and post the tariff imposition, world leaders from around the world, different parts, including Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, have called Prime Minister Modi, highlighting India's role, with Zelensky explicitly stating that Ukraine counts on India's contribution towards helping ending the war. Contribution towards helping to end the war. Similar to Scott Bessent's comments, Trump's top economic advisor warned that unless India does not stop Russian crude trade, the US and its president will not change the stance on the steep tariffs on Indian imports. Listen to this now.
One thing I think we've all learned is that you need to keep your eyes on the horizon and recognize that there are going to be ebbs and flows in things before we reach the final position. And if the Indians don't budge, I don't think President Trump will either.
Now, let's just take note of how the opposition, the Democrats, are reacting to the Trump administration's knee-jerk statements. In a statement, Democrats in the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee slammed Trump and his administration for imposing tariffs on India, stating that the tariffs on Indian imports are quote-unquote hurting Americans and sabotaging the US-India ties. That's not even all. The tariffs against India being an issue within the Republican camp as well. With former US Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, last week stating that the US should treat India as a prized, free, democratic partner. The reactions have been coming in, including US allies, analysts who understand the rising might of India as the largest democracy. With Australia's Trade Minister also becoming the latest one to condemn America's actions.
A country that believes in free and fair trade. We believe that the best way of ensuring prosperity for our workers and our country is to continue with free, fair and open trade. So we don't support the imposition of tariffs, whether they be on Australia or India. Protectionism is not the way to improve the prosperity of your populations. It's free and fair trade that will get you to that point.
And from all of this, one thing seems to be clear, that under pressure on India, the White House is clearly confused and contradictory. While the double standards by America are more than evident, it's the trust that is completely lost for the United States, interests being primary, it seems, and the only guiding principle, while trust seems to be simply tertiary. Our next story is from Gaza. It is facing famine. That's well known. But what is shocking is that while the entire world can see it, also different parts are condemning it, calling it man-made disaster even, the United States seems to not. And here's why we're saying that. At the United Nations Security Council, 14 out of 15 members, all except the United States, declared the famine in Gaza a man-made crisis. In fact, they reminded that starvation as a weapon of war is banned under international humanitarian law. They demanded the famine in Gaza must be stopped immediately. And just to put things into context here, 514,000 people, that's nearly a quarter of Gaza's population, already suffering through famine. By September, that number could rise to 641,000. Nearly 1.5 million people facing crisis levels of food insecurity. At least 132,000 children are projected to suffer from acute malnutrition between now and June next year. These figures come from the UN-backed Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Report. It is the world's most trusted authority on famine. And in a joint statement, UNSC members cited the IPC's figure calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, release of all hostages, unrestricted aid into Gaza, and for Israel to lift all the blockades on humanitarian supplies. But Israel has dismissed the report as false and biased, claiming the IPC relied on partial data from Hamas and ignored the recent food deliveries. The US-backed Israel's position, its acting ambassador to the UN, in fact, questioned the credibility and integrity of the IPC report, saying it does not pass the test on either. Meanwhile, Gaza continues to burn. Have a look at these images. They are fresh from today itself, showing Israeli tanks and troops amassing near Gaza's border. As plumes of smoke rise in the distance, Israeli airstrikes pounded the eastern and northern outskirts of Gaza City. Israel says its forces have returned to Jabalia to dismantle more Hamas tunnels and expand the combat operations. It's part of Israel's larger plan, basically, to take full control of Gaza City, which Israel has described as Hamas's last bastion. Ceasefire talks, meanwhile, mediated by Egypt and Qatar, remain stalled. Even though Hamas has accepted the latest proposal, the group says Israel's renewed offensive proves it is not serious about peace. According to Gaza's Civil Defense Agency, Israeli strikes killed at least 38 people on Wednesday, 16 of them in Gaza City. And so, as the war drags on, Washington also is quietly planning for Gaza's future. On Wednesday, US President Donald Trump hosted a White House meeting on post-war Gaza. He was reportedly joined by former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. What was discussed? It's not clear, but earlier this year, Trump had stunned the world by suggesting that the US should take control of Gaza, clear out its inhabitants, and redevelop it as a seaside real estate. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, meanwhile, praised that idea, prompting global outrage. For now, what is clear is this. In its 2 years of war in Gaza, Israel's offensive has already claimed at least 62,895 Palestinian lives, most of them civilians. And without urgent action, the famine there will take even more lives. A senior leader of Bangladesh Nationalist Party has claimed that efforts are being made to erase the memory of Bangladesh's 1971 liberation war from people's minds, saying that those who once aided the enemies are now raising their voices in public discourse. Speaking at an event in Dhaka, Mirza Fakhrul Islam Alamgir, the Secretary General of former Prime Minister Khaleda Zia's BNP, has said that it's not possible to forget the country's liberation war against Pakistan. He was apparently targeting fundamentalist Jamaat-e-Islami party, which had opposed the 1971 independence from Pakistan. He also warned that a form of extremism is on the rise in Bangladesh, which must not be allowed to grow, as it poses a threat to the country's spirit and existence. And during the Dhaka event, BNP's Alamgir raised concerns about the growing prevalence of corruption under the current interim government. He pointed out that corruption has become so widespread that it affects just about every aspect of public life. His comments came 2 days after the BNP suspended Zia's political advisor and 1971 veteran Fazlur Rahman's party membership for 3 months for breaching party policies and hurting people's religious sentiments. Rahman appeared as a key voice against the re-emergence of anti-liberation forces in the political arena during and after last year's movement, which toppled Sheikh Hasina and the Sheikh Hasina regime. In fact, in response to his suspension, Rahman said that he had never taken any action or made any statements that could be detrimental to his party and vowed never to do so in the future. He clarified that his criticism of Jamaat stemmed from his belief that they represented dark forces conspiring against both the July uprising and the liberation war. The BNP founder, meanwhile, played a defining role in 1971. On March 25, during Pakistan's crackdown, he revolted in Chittagong and soon after declared independence, giving direction to the freedom struggle. He later commanded Sector 1, Sector 11 and formed the famous Z Force, earning the gallantry title. With the elections approaching and the Awami League nearly absent from the political arena there, analysts and media reports suggesting that Khaleda Zia's BNP is emerging as the dominant force in the country. In what were threats so far, now a reality, European countries France, Britain and Germany initiated the process of reimposing UN-led sanctions on Iran over its much contested nuclear program. And what this essentially means is sweeping restrictions will now be reimposed on Iran's arms, missiles, nuclear technology under what can be called a snapback mechanism. And what this could also mean is that Iran could face the risk of being barred from key global trade and even face renewed economic isolation. Iran has called the reimposition of these sanctions, which were suspended almost a decade ago, unjustified and illegal, and vowed appropriate retaliation. Earlier, Iran had hit back, threatening to abandon all cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, if the sanctions were formalized. Now, what might seem like a recent development has actually been under consideration for months, something which is likely to strike a new low in Iran's ties with the West since Israel's attacks on the country's nuclear sites in the month of June, one which could lead to a bigger fallout with graver implications as far as nuclear diplomacy is concerned. For long now, the European powers, along with the United States, have blamed Iran for stockpiling near-weapon-grade uranium and blocking the UN inspectors. On the other hand, Tehran has justified the move, citing Washington's abandonment of the 2015 nuclear deal, both sides accusing each other of violations and so-called hypocrisy, a resolution for which appears to be far-fetched unless Washington and Tehran negotiate a new agreement. On Wednesday itself, the IAEA chief said that he met with the Secretary of State of the United States to discuss the issue of Iran ahead of the sanctions deadline, and called Iran's cooperation on the matter so far a work in progress.
How we do this? Iran passed legislation requiring certain security concerns to be addressed. We want to know what these concerns are, how we can address them. So they have a new system, internal system, which is, for us, it is, we don't have an issue with that.
Hailing the snapback of European sanctions, Rubio has said that America is open to direct engagement with Iran. The question now is, how will Iran respond? We'll have to wait and watch.